Hey, hi. Welcome to Someone Else's Movie, the original podcast where an actor, writer, director, or nebulous industry figure gives a little love to a movie they didn't make. I'm Norm Wilner, senior film writer for Now Magazine, and this is the other thing I do. My guest this week is Neasa Hardiman, a writer and director whose credits include tons of television, including episodes of Holby City, Casualty, and Happy Valley in the UK, and Marvel's Inhumans and Jessica Jones on this side of the Atlantic, including the series finale of Jessica Jones. Her first feature, the nautical quarantine thriller Sea Fever, premiered at TIFF in 2019, and it's now available on disc and on demand. It's a solid riff on some classic horror themes with engaging performances and a plot that is incredibly, unnervingly relevant to the current moment. Neasa picked Fritz Lang's M, the 1931 thriller about a city terrorized by a murderer of children, driving the police and the underworld to launch parallel investigations in order to make the streets safe again. It's a truly remarkable feat of movie making built around a complex and even sympathetic protagonist played by a baby-faced and utterly chilling Peter Lorre. Lang creates an entire genre here. There were no serial killer thrillers before this, and almost 90 years later, M still has the ability to slip under your skin and stay there. This is Someone Else's Movie.
I chose M because I'm a big Fritz Lang fan. I'm really blown away, first of all, of course, by the overall oeuvre, but by M in particular, for a number of different reasons. So it's made in 1931. It's made, 3 years after the first sound film has been made, and it's still, 90 years later, it still feels contemporary, it feels experimental, it feels edgy. I think the way that Fritz Lang juxtaposes image and sound in the film still feels formally innovative and interesting. I think the performances are spectacular, particularly Peter Lorre, who looks like he's about 12 in the film.
Yeah.
And he is just brilliant. He's evocative and emotive, and he gives this noir performance that is so incredibly well judged. And I think in terms of narrative, the film is very interesting because it sets us up with a story that's actually a story about two groups rather than two individuals, which, as you and I know, is an incredibly difficult thing to do.
Oh, yeah.
And it tells the story of these two groups and presents the audience with quite a complex moral conundrum, quite a difficult philosophical question that it chooses not to answer. It chooses just to let you sit with that question at the end. So for all those reasons, it feels like a very modernist film, even though it's 90 years old.
Yeah, I was really struck, and in researching it, I've watched it. I think I've seen it 3 times straight through, and a couple of other times in bits and pieces. And this time through, I was really struck in the way Lang claimed he was the first to do it, and for all I know, he was, to run the dialogue from one scene into another, and use it to inform the thematic connections, but also to pull the audience along, which gives this film, which is pretty static for a lot of, just the camera setups, the camera's either moving or absolutely locked down. And it can feel static, but it doesn't, because there is this ticking clock aspect to it. There's all this conflict going on the corners of the frame and the edges of the frame, and the sound going away the way it does. He doesn't bother with street noise. He doesn't bother with atmosphere. It's really just people talking or making physical contact with things.
Actually, I think his use of sound is absolutely fascinating. I think you're dead right. And the sound bridges are really fascinating. And the way that he uses voiceover and the way that he uses sound bridges through from one scene to another is compelling. And the way that he uses sound bridges between two different communities of people who are having kind of parallel but slightly different conversations is compelling. But I don't think that it's true to say that he only uses human voice. I think he does a really odd thing that still feels really strange to us 90 years later, where he uses a lot of street sounds, and he uses a lot of, the sounds of contemporary Berlin, of, car horns and traffic and the noise of street vendors and all that stuff. And then sometimes he just pulls it out.
That's what I mean. He's very strategic about it.
It's very deliberate, isn't it? It's none of it is accidental. I remember hearing your countryman Atom Agoyan talk at BAFTA many years ago.
Oh yeah.
And he made this very brilliant, I thought, observation where he said, look, essentially filmmaking is you're going to fall into one of two camps as a filmmaker. Either you're going to be in the spirit of Jean Renoir, where you want to try to reconstruct reality and make the audience feel like they are immersed in something that's really happening. And the camera just happens to be accidentally turned on, and everything is unfolding in the way that it does, in a slightly chaotic way, and you're an observer. And that's one kind of filmmaking, which can be really compelling. And obviously there are many filmmakers still to this day that work in that way. You could include people like Ken Loach or Andrea Arnold or Noah Baumbach. You know, sure. It's this verite, very realist approach to cinema. And he said, and the other camp essentially is Fritz Lang. The other camp is the camp where you decide you want to tell the truth about the world, not by simply having the camera as a mechanical recording device, but by using the camera as an active storytelling device, where every image is a considered image and every sound is a considered sound, and you're creating a completely artificial, allegorical, metaphorical world through which you're going to tell your story and articulate a deeper truth. And it really resonated with me at the time, because I thought that is what is so brilliant about Fritz Lang. That was what was so inventive about what he was doing with cinema. And when you watch something like M, it's all there. It's all there. You know, the extraordinarily well-considered structure of every single image, the way that he uses light, the way that he positions the camera so that it's slightly off angle, and you're getting these beautiful architectural shapes that are also unsettling.
Yeah, there are right angles everywhere. It's so disturbing.
And shadow and light and all those things. And you know, there's a point where you're looking up Inspector Lohmann's trousers, where you're seeing his garters and his vulnerability, even though he looks like this kind of mammoth creature in the frame, because you're looking right up at him. Or he puts the camera above a small elderly man who's about to be bullied by the crowd. There's a lot of top shots in this film, which is very unusual for the time. And the other thing that he does with the camera, which I absolutely love, it's really, I mean, you know, it's called expressionism for a reason. And the camera is incredibly expressive. So not only is he finding the angle which will articulate cinematically what the emotion of that scene is, articulate formally and visually, but also he's using, the camera is incredibly mobile. Like for 1931, it's absolutely extraordinary how much he's moving the camera. Yeah. And the camera is an active storytelling device all the time. And there are tricks that he does with the camera that have never been done before that film, and that you see other directors just copying over and over again, right up until the present day. Tricks that were copied in Citizen Kane, tricks that are copied in Martin Scorsese's films, tricks that are copied by all the great filmmakers, Steven Spielberg, that you see in M, and you go, it's so emotive and it's so expressive. And of course, the best filmmakers are going to ride on this man's coattails, because he is such an innovator. So you get images like there's a scene where the thieves come together and they're plotting how they're going to trap this killer. Yeah. First of all, the camera's very high, so you get the sense that, you know, you're getting the overall image of the scene, and then it cuts to their shadows on the wall, and the rest of the scene plays out with these guys in kind of shadow, leaning over each other. But you're not looking at them at all. You're just looking at this flat flock wallpaper with these shadows and the shadow of their smoke coming off their cigars. It's absolutely beautiful, and he holds it. There's another moment where Inspector Lohmann he's having a breakthrough in terms of the case by thinking it through, which, as you and I know, is an incredibly difficult thing to concretize in cinema. How do you think something through on camera and externalize it so that the audience understands? And Fritz Lang does this brilliant thing with the camera, where Lohmann is thinking about the name of this cigarette, which is called Ariston, and he goes, "So you found an Ariston." Ariston, and he's just repeating the word as he's thinking about it. And every time he speaks, the camera drifts in another couple of feet, and then it waits, and then he says the word again, and the camera drifts in a little bit more. It's genius. It's so expressive, and you are absolutely with that man, and you know what's going on, and it's externalized so beautifully. Another way that he gets around, one of the big problems of cinema always is, how do you show something that isn't there? So how do you show somebody looking for something and not finding it, right? This is a concrete medium, right?
Yeah.
We record pictures and sound. It's quite animal. So how do you show something that isn't there? And the way that he articulates the loss of a little girl is, in a contemporary film, the temptation for the director is not as good as Fritz Lang, might be, to show the body, which is grotesque, and nobody wants to see that. And it makes it a certain kind of film, which is not the kind of film that I think is worth anything. You don't want to do that. So how do you show that she's no longer there? And he does this absolutely beautiful thing where he shows her dinner plate. And her dinner plate is still clean, and there's still a knife and fork on either side. And he just holds on. And then the last time we saw her, she was holding a balloon, and it cuts to the balloon, which is tangled up in some telephone wires.
Yeah.
And now we know, and we know people are looking for her, and we know that she's gone. And it's it's such a beautiful tone poem. And the whole film is full of those things. It's full of these really visually articulate moments that are incredibly emotive and incredibly expressive.
Yeah, I wanted to come back to the top shots, to the overheads, because this time through it felt to me as though it's the moral position somehow, that the film doesn't really have room for God, but in 1931 it would be something that you would invoke. And I think he found the way to do that just by showing us. At first I thought it was a sociological thing, that you're watching people position themselves and move around and figure out, you're watching a society, or ultimately it's a movie about mob justice, but it isn't really a mob. It's an organized criminal concern. We see a mob early on, and it's distressing and frightening and messy, but also the victim is also identified in the same way with an overhead shot. The innocent man who is initially attacked. Yeah. And then subsequently, it's like swarming. It's like watching an insect intelligence, a collective form.
It's watching a collective. And that's such a brilliant thing about this film, isn't it? That notion of the collective, which it's just really hard to do in cinema.
Mm-hmm. And you hear about it all the time as an abstract concept. Oh, I'm sorry, I spoke over you.
No, that's exactly it. I think it's a very difficult thing to do. And particularly, you were talking about where he pulls sound out. There's the moment where Peter Lorre gets cornered by the collective, by this, incredibly well-organized group of criminals and beggars. And they corner him in the street, but they don't corner him by ganging up on him and getting really close. They corner him like a kind of like chess pieces, where they block off his exit, but he's still kind of 4 or 5 meters from everybody. So it's very COVID friendly.
Yes, it's true. What do they call that? A pincer movement.
Yes, exactly. They're all quite socially distant. But you're right, and there are a huge number of top shots in the film. I was really struck by that, and I think you're right. I think it is about saying, here is the community, whether it's the community of the police or the community of the thieves and the beggars. Here is the community in action, and here is how we see them. There's also an absolutely beautiful top shot where there's one thief who gets left behind in the building when the police raid the building. And there's a beautiful top shot where he's drilled down through one office to get into another. And you see him coming up from the lower office towards the camera. And it's the most elegant, beautifully constructed frame. It's completely circular. Yep. And as he comes towards us, the camera jibs up away from us and reveals that there's a circle of policemen all around him. And I thought, oh my God, it's the Hurt Locker.
Yeah, actually.
Hurt Locker that is absolutely that moment. Visually, it's exactly the same.
Yeah.
So it's those resonances are just going on through the generations of filmmakers.
Yeah. Although this one does actually have a joke in that scene. There aren't that many jokes in this movie, but I was really impressed with that one. Where they put your hands up. I'm holding a rope. I cannot put my hands up. It's so German. It's so logical.
There is another great joke where the chief inspector is trying to bully the same guy that the police have captured into telling them what they were doing breaking into the building.
Yeah.
And finally, the chief inspector is looking away from the guy, and he is one of almost every single person in the film is smoking throughout the film.
Also very German.
Yes, very Berlin. And they smoke a whole variety of different things, from roll-ups to pipes to big fat cigars to what look like reefers.
I saw a pipe with a cigar sticking out of it at one point.
That was a particularly unusual one, I felt. Anyway, Lohman has this great big fat cigar to indicate that, you know, he's a bougie kind of guy. And he has his back to the criminal, and the criminal tells him, we were looking for the child murderer. And Lohman, who up until this moment has been completely in possession of himself, drops his cigar and he tries to hide it from the guy behind him. And it's just a beautifully constructed shot where you don't need to cut away. You don't need to see both actors in close-up to absolutely see the mask fall from each of them for a moment, because they're not looking one another in the eye. You have both those performances in play at the same time, and it's both funny and tragic and exciting and thrilling, and moves the story forward. He's so economical.
Yeah, I was trying to think of other procedurals that have the same sort of economy that way, that parallel groups. M is credited with inventing both the serial killer film and the police procedural, and that's probably true, at least in terms of a sound narrative, the way that we relate to them now. But I just kept thinking of how precise it is in not showing us the thing that everyone is talking about. The violence, the actual child murdering, or even just
100%.
the mechanics of
it's a wonderful, wonderful film for that reason, that it's emotive and you feel the tragedy, but it's never exploitative.
Mm-hmm. It was pilloried at the time, but that was because there was a real child murder case happening in Germany at the time.
Can I just say the other thing that I absolutely love about the film, just apropos of it's being made in 1931, there's a couple of things. One is, I don't know if you speak German, but the Berlin accents in the film are terrific. That it's really colloquial Berlin in a way that cinema just wasn't at the time. You know, it would always be Hochdeutsch, and everybody would be speaking, you know, the equivalent of received. What are they called? Received pronunciation.
The formalism, or the Mid-Atlantic thing that was happening in America.
Exactly. Whereas these people are speaking proper street German, and they're speaking slang, and they speak like, you know, like street Berlin. And there's something so thrilling about that in a film that's that age. And that made me think, and of course the final scene in the film is 8 minutes long. It's a massive, big, long scene where he's tried by this community of beggars and thieves. And I was looking at it going, this feels like the Threepenny Opera, doesn't it?
It's very Brechtian.
It's so Brechtian. And so then I started looking at Bertolt Brecht and Fritz Lang, and of course they're contemporaries. And of course, Peter Lorre gets his start as an actor with Brecht.
I think he had actually been working with Brecht while they shot this. If the timelines line up, he was working on a play at the same time as making this.
It's really unsurprising, isn't it? Because suddenly you go, oh my God, this is the Threepenny Opera. Like the whole notion that there's this wonderfully civilized underworld of criminals and beggars, all of whom have membership numbers. And work in unison. Like it's really Brechtian.
The one thing that's missing is the musicality of it, the rhythms of it, but that's supplied by the whistling by Peer Gynt. So you sort of have a different motif. I kept thinking of Mac the Knife, of course, but it's actually more irritating to do Peer Gynt, to have something that just won't stop and then roots itself into your memory. So you leave the theater thinking, am I infected now? Is this some sort of murder virus that it's spread by the film? It's just so insidiously effective. And it's also
powerful, isn't it?
Yeah. And it's playful at the same time. So even though he's whistling it as a compulsion, it's what attracts children. It's what makes him feel approachable. And it's
pretty dark. Yeah, it's pretty dark, but you're right. And I mean, of course, in the Hall of the Mountain Kings, it's in a minor key. There's something kind of threatening about it, but it's also jaunty.
Yeah.
But I agree with you. I think it's another innovation in this film that has been taken up by generation upon generation upon generation of filmmakers. You know, it's a cliche of the genre now to say in this thriller there will be something that you associate with childhood in terms of singing or whistling that will be the mark of the killer. But this is where it comes from. This was the origin of the species.
Yeah.
And the way that he uses that tune, first of all, that it sounds jaunty the first time you hear it, and yet there's something, because it's in a minor key, you know, there's something wrong. Secondly, because he builds it into the way that the audience would have felt the novelty of sound, and therefore he makes sound such a crucial element of the storytelling. And then thirdly, that whereas he has beautifully and elegantly expressed this tune as the thing that we now associate, like Pavlov's dogs, with an imminent murder, that then he lets us follow Peter Lorre so we understand it's a compulsion. And we see him, you know, that scene where he's sitting in the cafe, and Fritz Lang does this wonderful thing with the camera as well, which is, again, feels so contemporary, where Peter Lorre goes into a cafe and we stay outside the cafe, and it looks like it's on there's a whole load of cafes, as I'm sure you know, on the Spree that are like this, with fencing and gorgeous ivy and different climbing flowers on the outside of the fencing. Mm-hmm. And so we're outside this fencing. Peter Lorre goes in, he sits in the outdoor area of the cafe, and the camera very slowly creeps in on him. So he's in this quite bucolic setting, and he puts his head in his hands and he starts whistling. And as the camera creeps in closer and closer to him, looking at him through the bars of the foliage, so we're now the predators. We're now the peeping Tom looking in at this man who is suffering and limited and in pain because of this disorder, and we feel it off him. And it's a complete turning of the tables. It's a humanizing of that figure, that although he is causing this horrible suffering, he too is suffering, and it's all done by means of this sound.
Yeah, and it doesn't let us disassociate from him. The identification with, I mean, we as the objective spectators, obviously we know more than any other character or anyone in the film ever knows, and Lang weaponizes that in a way that you don't often. Yeah. I mean, think about, I'm trying to think about the most famous serial killer films, or not the most famous, but the most popular ones. And I suppose Silence of the Lambs is the big one, which offers us just enough to connect to Buffalo Bill, mostly through Ted Levine's performance, but not through the material. We only see him as he sees himself. We never see him as pathetic. We never see him as hurting or in pain. He's fully monsterized. I guess that's what Thomas Harris does.
I think he's monstrous. Yeah, I think that figure is monstrous, and I think it's tied up a lot with sex and gender performance in a way that's quite troubling.
Oh well, yeah, it hasn't aged very well. It's true, but Thomas Harris.
I think the sexual politics of that film overall are interesting.
I'm folding in Red Dragon as well, in the way that Harris tried then at least to give the principal antagonist a tragic backstory. He had a cleft palate and was brutalized by his adoptive families, and then there's a lot that leads to this beautiful moment where someone gets to say, like, my heart bleeds for the child he was, but he's a monster and he needs to be put down. M doesn't do that. M gives us a portrait of someone who is, he's as much of a victim as the children he kills. It's just that
it's more human. I think it's richer and more intelligent. I think that he doesn't come down on the side of the vigilante or the side of murder in any kind of meaningful way. I think he's much more generous and much more human. The other thing that I would say about that I think is worth mentioning, and is probably rooted, as you say, in the kind of Brechtian aspects of the story, is how much agency the women in the film have. There's no question of they're not having a voice. All of the crowds in the film, which is really unusual for the time, and sadly still unusual, are made up of men and women. And in all of the scenes where the beggars' army has come together, or the beggars' organization has come together,
sure.
Where there are beggars and criminals, there are always women, and they always speak.
And they make the most cogent points too.
And they make really cogent points, and they, they're not. Neither are they limited to reproducing gender stereotypes. For instance, in that scene towards the end of the film, the one of the women who stands up says, "The mothers will have no mercy. The mothers whose children were taken from them will not allow him to live." And there's something really interesting about that as well, that he's not falling into some sort of romantic trope about, the tenderness of women or anything like that. This is 1931, and it feels really contemporary and really human, really open, and very smart.
Well, he lays that out at the very beginning as well, just with Elsa's mother just trying to hold herself together and not panic every time she talks to someone and asks if they've seen her. It's really, this time through, I found it really piercing in a way that I think the first time, I must have seen it for the first time maybe in the 90s. So it's been a while, but this time through, I really responded to that actor trying to layer things in a way.
Amazing, aren't they? They are amazing. She said that character is so withheld. I don't know the name of the actor, to my shame, but she gives this incredibly modern performance, just thinking that we've only just come out of silent cinema.
That's what I was going to say.
Yeah, the convention is that you have to slightly overstate it, kind of almost commedia dell'arte, to play it to the audience.
Oh, yeah.
And she delivers this really kind of modern, very withheld, non-theatrical performance. Peter Lorre as well. I mean,
I was going to say, he does not.
His performance is extraordinary.
Yeah, he keeps turning up his own tension.
And he keeps turning it. And the one thing that I hadn't noticed until I watched it this time, like you, every time you see it, you see other things in it.
Oh, yeah.
Is that, there's the moment where he has
clapped onto his back, yeah.
And he's walking around with this little girl who's going to be his next victim. And then she says to him, "There's schmutz on your jacket, I'll just wipe it off for you." And he looks in the mirror, realizes that he's being hunted, and he turns around and gives this great Peter Lorre face of total horror. And what I hadn't realized until I watched it this time is he breaks the fourth wall. He does it right into the lens.
Okay. I thought it was that he was responding to the person shadowing him from behind the car who ducks away. But I think you're right. We don't know about the other person yet.
It's incredibly arresting. And I actually stopped it and went back like, was that just what I thought? And it is. It's like bang, straight down the barrel of the lens. And it makes your heart stop. You go, because he's looking right at you. But he's looking at you like he's terrified of you. It's such an incredibly interesting visual innovation. And it's the only time he breaks the fourth wall in the whole film. But it's, of course, it is the fulcrum of the film. It's the hinge point of the film.
Yeah. Even his confession / soliloquy, I think it's a confession. I mean, he's acknowledging that he is the murderer, but he doesn't see it that way. And he has his argument. Even that is played as theater to the audience. It's not directed it's directed to the audience of beggars and thieves. It's not directed to us. And that, we were talking about the camera work being with all the top shots, but that one beautiful pan that just doesn't stop with hundreds of people, the entirety of Berlin's underworld is there in judgment of him. That's just so arresting. It's
so arresting, and it's so startling, and it's both a portrait of community, and it's also quite threatening, isn't it? Because he does that Hitchcockian thing, even though, of course, he's before Hitchcock, of making you feel for the person that you really should be trying to punish, but you're in it with Peter Lorre in that moment going, oh, Jesus Christ, they are all here. They're all here. And he's trapped. But that thing, I was also really struck by how existential that is. What is it? He gets stuck in this loop, Peter Lorre, where he's going, ich will nicht, ich muss, I don't want to, but I have to. I don't want to, but I have to. Which is, of course, pure Beckett.
It's true.
I can't go on, I must go on. I can't go on, I must go on. But and he leaves us there. Fritz Lang leaves us there going, this is the circle that he's trapped in. Like, what are you going to do about that? It's an incredibly intelligent and emotionally intelligent piece of work.
Yeah, he's a pitiable monster. He needs to be stopped. There's never any question. The film does not, for a second, sympathize with him, but we are allowed to, which I found really interesting. And to think that, as you say, they're inventing this as they go, because not only has there not been a movie like this before, but there's not been a performance or a genre or an approach. I did an episode about Casablanca with, and we realized as we were talking about it that we're watching a group of Eastern European refugees make a movie about the world they just escaped from and invent that sort of resistance-themed studio picture.
Yes. It is interesting, isn't it? And
Yeah.
you can't, I think you're absolutely right. I kept thinking about that while I was watching it, going, this is 1931. In 2 years' time, both Peter Lorre and Fritz Lang are going to escape from Germany. So what's under the surface of this film? What's bubbling under the surface here? Who are they actually talking to in Germany, in Berlin at this moment?
Yeah.
Because it's really left-wing film. It's, it's about the collective. It's about extending sympathy to everybody. It's about trying not to stand in judgment, but rather to understand. And yet it's also about the necessity for the rule of law and the necessity for protecting people. And the way that the story ends with these women going, whatever you do to him, it won't bring the children back. Which is, an amazing, brilliant piece of propaganda, not propaganda, but an amazing argument against state violence.
Yeah.
And he leaves you there in this quandary.
Yeah.
But I really agree with you. I think it's very much a film that's quite obviously reflective of those big tectonic plates that are about to clash together in Europe.
Yeah.
And in Berlin in particular.
Yeah, jokingly, I was thinking of it as the first social justice movie, because that sort of is what you see.
Yeah.
But in the shadow...
It's very different from the other films that you're told, or not. It's not different from Casablanca. It's very similar to Casablanca in those terms, I think, in that it extends sympathy to everybody. But very different from the other thrillers that you were talking about.
Yeah.
In that it doesn't elicit disgust from you. That's not what it's trying to do. It's not trying to make you disgusted with another human. It's trying to make you understand other people.
Yeah. The booklet in the Criterion edition includes 3 essays that were written around the same time as the film's release, or 2 one was by Lang and 2 are directly as a result of the film's release. One of them is this horrified review by someone who speaks in outraged tones of the sadism and the monstrosity at work in the film, and how when a child hands her future murderer his knife, we're supposed to be ripped apart by the sadism and the cruelty on display. And it's just, I didn't see that at all. I mean, it's horror. It is true horror, but it's also sad. It's this child's innocence being maintained up until the moment of her death, which is somehow tragic in a way that I don't know that any other...
He doesn't get killed also, that child.
Oh, that's right. She gets to run away. Or at least, do we see? Yes, we do.
He runs away. So she's not actually a victim in the end. But you are right that there's a level of trust there. It's funny, I watched the film with my daughter, who said, wow, children are never allowed to run around cities like that anymore.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, it's a soundstage, if that makes it any better.
Yeah.
But
but I was thinking about it. I'm the youngest of my family, and my the eldest of my siblings is 10 years older than me, and she would, at the age of 7 or 8, catch a bus across town to come back home from school at lunchtime.
Yeah.
And then walk out and catch a bus across town to go back to school. Those days are gone.
Yeah. When I was 10, so 1978, I was taking a bus down, a good 45-minute bus ride to school with my brother. So we were always together. Maybe that was part of the strategy. But yeah, I can't imagine that happening now, although it was sort of nice then.
Lovely. It's lovely. Yeah.
Yeah. And then you realize you're speaking from a child's perspective, where you had no idea of what was out there in the world and the miseries everywhere. It's a form of insulation. But yeah, that's just not a thing anymore.
No, it's not a thing. But the other lovely thing, and you are right, that there's this constant juxtaposition between trust and betrayal, between the children's trust and his imminent betrayal of that trust. And the way that those shots are framed, again, he just uses the artillery, the language of cinema, to be really economical in showing you that. So there's that beautiful image of Peter Lorre looking in at, it's a shop full of spoons and forks and knives.
Yeah.
And he's looking through the window, and we're looking from inside the shop, looking out at him, and he's framed by this beautiful display of knives. And then he looks up at something that's in the window that's a reflection, and it's a reflection of a little girl who is now also framed with knives.
Yeah.
And that's as close as he gets to saying anything explicit. And it's elegant and economical and threatening. And you can see Hitchcock looking at that and learning, because it's very reflective of the way that Hitchcock uses visual storytelling. And there it is, absolutely beautiful. And the other thing that's really lovely about that same sequence, which is completely nonverbal, is so we see Peter Lorre surrounded by knives. We see the little girl also surrounded by knives. And then we cut back to Peter Lorre, and now we're outside the shop looking at him. And because we're outside the shop looking at him, he is now reflected back at us through the glass as well. So now there's two of him. And you get that notion of splitting, which is, of course, what's happening, what Fritz Lang is trying to tell us is happening in this man's head.
Yeah.
Is he's splitting into the version of himself going, ich will, and the version of himself going, no, ich muss, and ich will nicht. The version of him that's going, I have to, but I don't want to. And the splitting is happening visually on screen for us. It's an incredibly elegant, intelligent, visually creative piece of storytelling with no words spoken.
Yeah. I wonder how many innovations stopped once we saw the first wave. You know, once you saw how the rules should work, you stopped thinking about how to defy them.
It's an interesting idea, isn't it? Yeah. I mean, I do think, I know, I read somewhere Fritz Lang thought this was his best film. I think it's his best film. I think it's his most emotionally articulate. And I think it's the one where he really concretizes that kind of expressionist cinema through sound and picture. Yeah. We haven't talked about the other kind of great joke in the film, which is the woman who is the murderer's landlady is deaf.
Yes.
And that's conversely, true. The man who actually identifies the murderer is blind.
Yeah. Which again is more of a sense of the collective, right? Because your perceived weaknesses become strengths to the larger, to the greater good.
And it's Fritz Lang going, we're telling you a story with picture and sound, but actually you only need one in order to piece together what the world is. Or if you have, exactly as you say, if you have the collective around you, even though he is exploiting image and sound in the most profound way himself.
Yeah, it's so, I mean, I'm a big fan of Ministry of Fear, but yeah, I think this is easily his best work. It's just, it feels like the future, right? I mean, you said it yourself, it feels like a contemporary film, but it also feels like it's still going forward. That there's a moment where when Laurie is cornered in the warehouse, in the office building, the camera just fires itself at him, rushes at him, and Scorsese's ripped that off a couple of times, but it is so powerful. This time really just thinking, oh, right, of course, it's just an incredibly jarring, powerful image. It puts us in the shoes of the pursuers again, but also it just made me realize none of those other beautiful gliding shots was accomplished with a Steadicam.
Yes,
he was just holding it back.
That's so true. That's so true. And, we haven't really talked about the editing either. And the editing is just feels so modern in this film. And he's so playful with the editing. There's that whole sequence where you see the two communities. You see the community of the police and the community of the thieves and the beggars. And they're both kind of ruminating on how they're going to try and catch this guy. And he keeps editing on gesture. He's editing on continuity of gesture. And it's just beautiful. And of course, it does exactly what editing on the continuity of gesture does, which is to say these people are the same. And yet he's doing it in 1931. Nobody's going to do that again for another 10 years.
I know, it's incredible.
Beautiful moving camera shots where he's, the camera glides forward and glides in, and then suddenly he's cutting, but you don't feel the cut and it glides up to something else. He's enjoying it. Yeah.
It's the pleasure of the form. I mean, I think that's almost edging into adventure film territory, which people would have recognized from the silence. And so it puts you on the back foot for the horror, for the murder stuff. It's just, it's thrilling to be with the mob in those moments. And I think that's part of his point as well. But just to know, God damn it, just to know all that in 1931, I'm in awe of him.
It is extraordinary. It's an extraordinary piece of work. I really agree. And, it still feels innovative, which I think is just the most incredible achievement.
Yeah. There's just no hint of being tied to the silent era or stagecraft or any of the things that so many films are just clearly relying on from that era. I mean, even I'm trying to think of, the comedies of the time where you had to keep the camera static because the microphone was on a plant in the center of the table and you couldn't you just, all the singing in the rain jokes, but those actually applied then. And here's a film that just doesn't seem to care. It's not concerned about what you do with sound or what you do with a boom microphone or cables. He just found a way in every shot to make it interesting and make it alive. Which,
you know what? It's a really good point. I read somewhere that only 30% of the film is shot sync sound.
That would make sense.
And that all the rest of it is post sound. And there's something interesting about that, I think, for us as filmmakers, that he's using the sound as a separate layer, as a separate storytelling layer. That's not just about pictures of people talking. It's actually about other things. And I think that, again, is something that Hitchcock very strongly picked up on. And I think it was he who coined that idea of, I don't want to make films that are just pictures of people talking. That the sound is a separate event. It does its own thing. Occasionally there's sync sound with the actors, but that's not actually the key thing that the sound is doing in this film. It's, as you say, it's the Hall of the Mountain Kings. It's the moments with the traffic. It's those sudden sounds that are embedded in silence, like when the woman goes, "The cops are coming!" and we've had complete silence before that. Or when you get the beggars in this silence of the street suddenly whistling to one another. And so it becomes this kind of piercing story beat. And I think that for us as contemporary filmmakers is still something that's worth investigating.
Yeah, I can't think of many contemporary films that try the same thing. Other than, music for a jump scare, but that's meta-narrative. That's a completely different thing. To have it happen within the world it's a bigger risk, I guess.
It's a bigger risk. I think you're right. I think you need to be really in charge of your craft to do it and hold the audience, right?
I think so, yeah. Paul Thomas Anderson probably does it. Oh, he does, actually, in Punch Drunk Love with Shattering the Glass. It's the one time I can think of him doing that.
Oh, that's a good point.
Yeah. So he's a master. Fine. We knew that. Is there anything of M that you have? I was trying to think of it in terms of Sea Fever or Jessica Jones, and I'm not coming up with too many options, but is there anything of M that you have borrowed or lifted or stolen outright over the course of your career?
I'm very influenced. I think I started out in visual art, and I'm very influenced by the overall approach that Fritz Lang and his contemporaries have to the way that stories should be, or the way that stories can be. And the big influence that I take from all of his cinema is that idea that you can set up a parallel world which is based on one metaphorical idea, which is that really Brechtian idea. It's interesting that he's a contemporary of Brecht, and he is using that idea, I think. We're setting up a world that's obviously not the real world, and I'm going to make the characters as honest and human and layered and three-dimensional as I can, and I'm going to put a big metaphor in the middle of that story, and that metaphor is going to resonate and sound like a gong all the way through this film, and it's going to carry you out of the cinema. And the experience of watching the film is going to feel like a dream, in the true sense of feeling like a dream, because it's rooted in symbolism, but the symbolism is being articulated through proper conflicted three-dimensional characters. And that's what I think I try to do. And I think Sea Fever is an expressionist film for that reason.
Okay.
That every image is a considered image. The palette is considered. The sound is considered. They operate as active storytelling devices, and it's rooted in a recognizable, grounded reality with a central Brechtian metaphor.
And speaking of metaphors and Sea Fever, I would be remiss because all of a sudden you've made a quarantine film, a year ahead of the actual quarantine. It's a movie that is almost entirely consumed by the end with the debate over saving other people by keeping yourself in one place. How does that happen? I mean, I can't be the first person who's presented this to you, but how is that going now? What's the effect of all the commentary suddenly changing from what it was when you played at TIFF to what it is now?
It's funny you should say that. And a lot of people obviously say to me, wow, it's such a coincidence. But actually, it's not really a coincidence, because when I was writing the film, when we were making the film, we were thinking about the climate crisis. And you go, okay, well, so what are the big fissures culturally that when you press down on them start to open up and become painful? And the fissures in our culture at the time, it seemed to me, what's the reason why the climate crisis is so painful and difficult? It's because we've set ourselves up as if we are individuals in competition with one another, as if we're atomized, and as if Margaret Thatcher's adage was true. She famously said there's no such thing as society, and that we're all just individual actors that have to act against each other in a zero-sum game. And when we do that, then the pressures of economic success have to be primary. But the problem with the climate crisis and COVID is exactly the same, is that the pressures of individual success don't really apply. I can't succeed unless I join hands with you. I can't succeed if I only look after my family. I have to think about everybody else as well, and we will all succeed together. There is such a thing as society. No man is an island. We are a community. And I think the climate crisis at the time, that's what I was thinking of, because that was the thing that was pointing that up to us so specifically. But COVID does exactly the same thing. It's exactly the same kind of crisis. And what you see is exactly the same pressures being placed on the most vulnerable people, which is, well, you can either have economic survival or you can have health survival, but you can't have both. And that's an impossible quandary. That is the ultimate in cruelty. And of course, in ecological terms, it's like you can either be economically barely surviving, or you can think about the climate crisis, but you can't do both at the same time because they're mutually exclusive if we live in an atomized world.
Right.
And I think that's why that's exactly what those people in that story are dealing with, is how do I take responsibility? Do I have to take responsibility just for myself and run? Or do I have to take responsibility for the people on the boat and risk everybody else? Or do I have to take responsibility for the place that we're coming home to, and therefore protect them, even though I don't know them, from the possibility that I and my friends here on the boat might be a risk to them? And where do you draw that line? And there's no clear answer to that, as we know from COVID. But I feel like it's not really a big coincidence for that reason, because that is the big fissure that we're dealing with culturally.
Yeah. And it is fascinating how COVID has, if nothing else, we may not know where to draw the line, but we've learned who's interested in trying to find it and who just doesn't care at all.
Yeah. Those people who think that everybody is pitted against each other and, it's me or you, one of us will win, but we can't both win. And those of us who see ourselves as part of a community and who see that winning is something that we do together.
My thanks to Neasa Hardiman, whose first feature, Sea Fever, is available now on disc and on demand and streaming in the US on Hoopla and Hulu. It's a solid debut, and I'm very eager to see what she does next. Also, sorry about the bleep, but I promise you'll find out who picked Casablanca very soon. You can find Neasa on Twitter at Neasa Hardiman, all one word, and you can find M on Blu-ray and DVD in an excellent restoration from the Criterion Collection. It's also streaming on the Criterion Channel and available on Apple TV. As always, you can find me on Twitter at Norm Wilner and elsewhere on the internet at nowtoronto.com, where I host a bunch of podcasts in addition to writing about film and television. You should check those out too. And you can find this podcast on Twitter at Semcast, SEMcast, and on the web at someoneelsesmovie.com. Our theme song is by The Last Year. If you like it, or the show in general, please say so. Leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Google Podcasts or wherever you've been enjoying us. Every little bit helps, it truly does. And check out the other shows on the Frequency Podcast Network. They're pretty good. Stay inside, watch movies, wear a mask if you go out. I'll see you next time.